Chapter 11. The night was impenetrably dark. The moon had been rising later and later every night until now it was seen only at dawn. And whenever the moon forsook evening and rose at cockcrow, the nights were as black as charcoal. Zinma and her mother sat on a mat on the floor after their supper of yam fufu and bitter leaf soup. A palm oil lamp gave out yellowish light. Without it, it would have been impossible to eat. One could not have known where one's mouth was in the darkness of that night. There was an oil lamp in all the 4 huts on Okonkwo's compound, and each hut, seen from the others, looked like a soft eye of yellow half-light set in the solid massiveness of night. The world was silent except for the shrill cry of insects, which was part of the night, and the sound of wooden mortar and pestle as Nuaiki pounded her fufu. Nuaiki lived 4 compounds away, and she was notorious for her late cooking. Every woman in the neighborhood knew the sound of Nuaiki's mortar and pestle. It was also part of the night. Okonkwo had eaten from his wife's dishes and was now reclining with his back against the wall. He searched his bag and brought out his snuff bottle. He turned it onto his left palm, but nothing came out. He hit the bottle against his knee to shake up the tobacco. That was always the trouble with Okeke's snuff. It very quickly went damp, and there was too much saltpeter in it. Okonkwo had not bought snuff from him for a long time. Udigo was the man who knew how to grind good snuff, but recently he had fallen ill. Low voices, broken now and again by singing, reached Okonkwo from his wives' huts as each woman and her children told folk stories. Ekwefi and her daughter Azinma sat on a mat on the floor. It was Ekwefi's turn to tell a story. The world was silent except for the shrill cry of insects, which for part of the night, and the sound of her, here we go. Back here. Once upon a time, she began, all the birds were invited to a feast in the sky. They were very happy and began to prepare themselves for the great day. They painted their bodies with red camwood and drew beautiful patterns on them with uli. Tortoise saw all these preparations and soon discovered what it all meant. Nothing that happened in the world of the animals ever escaped his notice. He was full of cunning. As soon as he heard of the great feast in the sky, his throat began to itch at the very thought. There was a famine in those days, and Tortoise had not eaten a good meal for 2 moons. His body rattled like a piece of dry stick in his empty shell. So he began to plan how he would go to the sky. But he had no wings, said Azinma. Be patient, replied her mother. That is the story. Tortoise had no wings, but he went to the birds and asked to be allowed to go with them. We know you too well, said the birds when they had heard him. You are full of cunning and you are ungrateful. If we allow you to come with us, you will soon begin your mischief. You do not know me, said Tortoise. I am a changed man. I've learned that a man who makes trouble for others is also making it for himself. Tortoise had a sweet tongue, and within a short time, all the birds agreed that he was a changed man, and they each gave him a feather, with which he made 2 wings. At last, the great day came, and Tortoise was the first to arrive at the meeting place. When all the birds had gathered together, they set off in a body. Tortoise was very happy and voluble as he flew among the birds, and he was soon chosen as the man to speak for the party because he was a great orator. There was one important thing which we must not forget, he said as they flew on their way. When people are invited to a great feast like this, they take new names for the occasion. Our host in the sky will expect us to honor this age-old custom. None of the birds had heard of this custom, but they knew that Tortoise, in spite of his failings in other directions, was a widely traveled man who knew the customs of different peoples, and so they each took a new name. When they had all taken, Tortoise also took one. He was to be called All of You. At last, the party arrived in the sky, and their hosts were very happy to see them. Tortoise stood up in his many-colored plumage and thanked them for their invitation. His speech was so eloquent that all the birds were glad they had brought him, and nodded their heads in approval of all he said. Their host took him as the king of the birds, especially as he looked somewhat different from the others. After kola nuts had been presented and eaten, the people of the sky set before the guests the most delectable dishes Tortoise had ever seen or dreamed of. The soup was brought out hot from the fire, and in the very pot in which it had been cooked. It was full of meat and fish. Tortoise began to sniff aloud. There was pounded yam, and also yam pottage cooked with palm oil and fresh fish. There was also pots of palm wine. When everything had been set before the guests, one of the people of the sky came forward and tasted a little from each pot. Then he invited the birds to eat. But Tortoise jumped to his feet and asked, For whom have you prepared this feast? For all of you, replied the man. Tortoise turned to all the birds and said, You remember that my name is all of you. The custom here is to serve the spokesman first and the others later. They will serve you when I have eaten. He began to eat, and the birds grumbled angrily. The people of the sky thought it must be their custom to leave all the food for their king. And so Tortoise ate the best part of the food and drank 2 pots of palm wine so that he was full of food and drink, and his body filled out in his shell. The birds gathered round to eat what was left and to peck at the bones he had thrown all about the floor. Some of them were too angry to eat. They chose to fly home on an empty stomach. But before they left, each took back the feather he had lent to Tortoise, and there he stood in his hard shell, full of food and wine, but without any wings to fly home. He asked the birds to take a message for his wife, but they all refused. In the end, Parrot, who had felt more angry than the others, suddenly changed his mind and agreed to take the message. Tell my wife, said Tortoise, to bring out all the soft things in my house to cover the compounds with them so that I can jump down from the sky without very great danger. Parrot promised to deliver the message and then flew away. But when he reached Tortoise's house, he told his wife to bring out all the hard things in the house. And so she brought out her husband's hoes, machetes, spears, guns, and even his cannon. Tortoise looked down from the sky and saw his wife bringing things out, but it was too far to see what they were. When all seemed ready, he let himself go. He fell and fell and fell until he began to fear that he would never stop falling. And then, like the sound of his cannon, he crashed on the compound. Did he die? Asked Azimma. No, replied Akwefi. His shell broke into pieces. But there was a great medicine man in that neighborhood. Tortoise's wife sent for him, and he gathered all the bits of shell and stuck them together. That's why the tortoise's shell is not smooth. There's no song in the story, Azimma pointed out. No, said Akwefi. I shall think of another one with a song, but now it's your turn. Once upon a time, Azimma began, Tortoise and Cat went to wrestle against yams. No, that's not the beginning. Once upon a time, there was a great famine in the land of animals. Everyone was lean except Cat, who was fat and whose body shone as if oil was rubbed on it. She broke off because at that very moment a loud and high-pitched voice broke the outer silence of the night. It was Cielo, the priestess of Agbala, prophesizing. There was nothing new in that. Once in a while, Cielo was possessed by the spirit of her god, and she began to prophesy. But tonight, she was addressing her prophecy and greetings to Okonkwo, and so everyone in his family listened. The folk stories stopped. Agbala du, Agbala ekeneo, came the voice like a sharp knife cutting through the night. Okonkwo, Agbala akene gio, Apala cholu ifu ada ya azinmayo. At the mention of Azimma's name, Akwefi jerked her head sharply like an animal that had sniffed death in the air. Her heart jumped painfully within her. The priestess had now reached Okonkwo's compound and was talking with him outside his hut. She was saying again and again that Agbala wanted to see his daughter Azimma. Okonkwo pleaded with her to come back in the morning because Azimma was now asleep. But Cielo ignored what he was trying to say and went on shouting that Agbala wanted to see his daughter. Her voice was as clear as metal, and Okonkwo's women and children heard from their huts all that she said. Okonkwo was still pleading that the girl had been ill of late and was asleep. Akwefi quickly took her to their bedroom and placed her on their high bamboo bed. Priestess screamed, Beware, Okonkwo, she warned. Beware of exchanging words with Agbala. Does a man speak when a god speaks? Beware. She walked through Okonkwo's hut into the circular compound and went straight toward Akwefi's hut. Okonkwo came after her. Akwefi, she called, Agbala greets you. Where is my daughter Azimma? Agbala wants to see her. Akwefi came out from her hut carrying her oil lamp in her left hand. There was a light wind blowing, so she cupped her right hand to shelter the flame. Noe's mother, also carrying an oil lamp, emerged from her hut. The children stood in the darkness outside their hut, watching the strange event. Okonkwo's youngest wife also came out and joined the others. Where does Agbala want to see her? Akwefi asked. Where else but in his house, in the hills and the caves, replied the priestess. I will come with you too, Akwefi said firmly. Tufiya, the priestess cursed, her voice cracking like an angry bark of thunder in the dry season. How dare you, woman, to go before the mighty Agbala of your own accord? Beware, woman, lest he strike you in his anger. Bring me my daughter. Akwefi went into her hut and came out again with Azimma. Come, my daughter, said the priestess. I shall carry you on my back. A baby on its mother's back does not know that the way is long. Azimma began to cry. She was used to Cielo calling her my daughter, but it was a different Cielo now that she saw in the yellow half-light. Don't cry, my daughter, said the priestess, lest Agbala be angry with you. Don't cry, said Akwefi. She will bring you back very soon. I shall give you some fish to eat. She went back into the hut again and brought down a smoked black basket in which she kept her dried fish and other ingredients for cooking soup. She broke a piece in two and gave it to Azimma, who clung to her. Don't be afraid, said Akwefi, stroking her head, which was shaved in places, leaving a regular pattern of hair. They went out again. The priestess bent down on one knee, and Azimma climbed on her back, her left palm closed on her fish, and her eyes gleaming with tears. Agbala du, Agbala Ekeneo, Chela began once again to chant greetings to her god. She turned around sharply and walked through Okonkwo's hut, bending very low at the eaves. Azimma was crying loudly now, calling her mother. The two voices disappeared into the thick darkness. A strange and sudden weakness descended on Akwefi as she stood gazing in the direction of the voices like a hen whose only chick had been carried away by a kite. Azimma's voice soon faded away, and only Cello was heard moving farther and farther in the distance. Why do you stand there as though she had been kidnapped? Asked Okonkwo as he went back into his hut.